Hong Kong Sign Language is a sign language used by the deaf people of Hong Kong. A 2014 consensus in Hong Kong stated that approximately 155,200 people have some sort of hearing impairment, and within this, 4,300 people were fully deaf. Only 3,900 people out of all who were surveyed knew how to speak sign language. Hong Kong Sign Language originated in Hong Kong around the 1930s, and the first school dedicated specifically for the deaf was established in 1935 as the Hong Kong School for the Deaf. Though sign language was taught to the students in class, the students would create their own phrases and words outside of the classroom, thus creating one of the first variations of Hong Kong Sign Language. However, by 2004, the school converted into a traditional school where sign language was almost never allowed in classrooms. Several decades following World War II, deaf schools began to emerge around Hong Kong. Throughout all 8 of the institutions, there were just under 2,000 students studying at these establishments. Several of the institutions, such as the Hill Chong Special School for the Deaf, allowed both sign language and spoken language to be used interchangeably in the classroom. Other institutions, such as Overseas Chinese School for the Deaf and Dumb, communicated in sign language throughout all the lessons. Around the 1950s, the school was established and it became a place where sign language from Nanjing and Shanghai were integrated into the Hong Kong Sign Language.
Hong Kong Sign Language, also known as HKSL, is derived from Chinese Sign Language, specifically from the Southern dialect. After years of HKSL education systems and schooling, they were then considered an individual language and isolated. As mentioned, this language is indeed related to Chinese Sign Language and a mixture of both Shanghai and Nanjing's adaptation of CSL. As time progressed, the ways in which the signing advanced spontaneously was based on the regular contact between deaf individuals. HKSL also grew through the Hong Kong School for the Deaf, which was also known as HKSD. This school was a residential school that was created by missionaries in 1935 and had extremely high boarding rates. However, they had very strict circumstances. Before 1968, all of the students were required to stay in their dormitories and were only allowed to travel home a few times a year during holidays. In this school, many of the students ended up creating their own recreation of different signs due to how broad and simple the language and signs were. The signs were too loosely organized and the peer teaching was rarely observed, resulting in the newly made hand gestures between the students. Decades after, more deaf schools were set up, one of which was formed by a deaf couple called Overseas Chinese School for the Deaf and Dumb. Unlike the other school, this school was a day school and had limited amounts of dormitories solely for students who lived further away from home. Because the teachers there could hear, both spoken and sign language were used during lessons. The students here also believed that creating their own language was unacceptable as they should learn from educators. It was more authentic.
Hong Kong Sign Language has a basic word order of subject, verb, object. The example Quan also has a drippy nose is produced by the first subject Quan, verb also had, object drippy nose. Hong Kong Sign Language is quite rich in inflection as it is an angulating language. This is also what sets the language apart from Mandarin and Cantonese, as they are analytic languages and lack inflectional morphological markers such as tense and agreement. Evidently, in sign, the use of hands are the biggest part of communication, and the space where these signs are created is called the signing space. This signing space is used to create the morphological inflection, and inflections show the different aspects of verbs or agree with plurality. In Hong Kong Sign Language, pronominals, which act as pronouns, mark plurality but not gender, and plural pronominals are created by the index finger directed at reference and in circular movements or in an open and flat B palm. The use of classifiers in Hong Kong Sign Languages, as well as in other sign languages, are a way of showing locative information. Classifiers are proforms and they're usually combined with a verb root of motion or location to form a predicate. In the signing space, the way classifiers are placed can correspond directly to the spatial relation between the entities, and most sign languages have separate classifiers for animate objects. In Hong Kong Sign Languages, it is created by a closed fist with the pinky and thumb out, kind of like a surf's up sign. In Hong Kong Sign Languages, it uses a three-way person agreement, first, second, and third, to mark grammatical relationships, which is expressed through the direction of movement and location of reference. While verb agreement morphology is expressed through modulating movement in space, which could be overlaid with additional movements to encode aspectual morphology. For example, repeating a sentence but adding more intensity.
Now we are moving on to phonology. There are 3 parameters for Hong Kong Sign Language. The first parameter is hand shapes. In the newest version of an online dictionary established by the Chinese University of Hong Kong, they have included 65 hand shapes in the dictionary. HKSL uses the one-handed finger spelling system of ASL, that hand shapes are mostly produced by the dominant hand, and some are produced with the help of the other. There are many examples of minimal pairs for hand shapes. This is the sign for difficult, and this is the sign for no. These 2 signs share the same location of hands and the same movements of hands. They are only different in the hand shapes, and their meanings are completely different. The second parameter for HKSL is location. There was no exact number found for locations. However, it is clear that the difference between locations are made within and between body regions, like many other sign languages. Changing the location of the hand can change the meaning of the sign completely. This sign is for poor, and this one is for age. As shown in the pictures, these 2 signs have the same hand shape and movements of the hand. The only difference between them is the location. The third parameter for HKSL is movement. In an analysis done by Mack and Tang in 2012, they categorized all the movements into 3 different types. The first type includes signs with no movements. The second type includes signs that have simplex movements. These are movements that only involve changes in path, orientation, or aperture movement. The third type include those that have complex movements, which means that these signs require combinations of simplex movements. There are signs that are contrastive in movements as well. This is a sign for quiet, and this one is the sign for mother. You can see that both of them have the same hand shape, and they are both placed in front of the mouth. The only difference is the movement of the index finger. The index finger moves sideways for the sign quiet, and moves back and forth for the sign mother. There are also allophones in Hong Kong Sign Language. One example can be the sign for thank you. This sign requires the person to only move the big thumb. Signing thank you super close to the chest or a little bit further out mean exactly the same thing. The distance between the hand and the chest is an allophone in this situation. The parameters can also be iconic in HKSL. For instance, the movement of the sign for flower is iconic. The movement of the hand resembles the process of a flower bud grows and opens up.
Conservation status and future prospects. The language currently has an estimated 9,000 users worldwide and holds a status of threatened. While it is currently recognized as a language, there are almost no formal education opportunities, as most schools employ an oralist learning approach. This means that most deaf signers are bilingual with the surrounding spoken language. Despite the population having an estimate of 155,200 deaf people, schools only teach with a spoken language approach, meaning that deaf people are taught to lip read to understand speech. There is far less formal education regarding sign language than there should be, as the teaching of these would be very useful for deaf people. Despite the lack of resources, many deaf people in Hong Kong still use Hong Kong Sign Language to communicate. Altogether, very little is known about this sign language, but raising awareness to the lack of formal resources for deaf people is the first step to allowing them an easier life and a way of communicating that is convenient for them. Many believe that the main reason that sign languages are not officially recognized is because majority of the speaking population does not believe that it is necessary to learn sign language. As a result, not all deaf people use sign language or gestures to communicate at the risk of not being understood by other people. Along with that, not everyone who is deaf from birth. Some people develop it after learning to speak their entire lives, so it may be difficult for them to learn an entire new language. Some also believe that relying only on sign languages can limit the opportunities in a person's life. For example, an employer might not hire someone who cannot converse verbally. Because of these reasons, it would be difficult for society to be inclusive without granting sign language an official status. However, other ways that we could enhance this language can involve introducing sign language to other people or by hiring more translators. As for why there is not a universal sign language, we believe that it would not be possible due to barriers like grammar and differences between languages. Languages have their own unique traits and can even have words that do not exist across all languages. Despite this, we acknowledge that most sign languages have many similarities that allow for anyone that has any knowledge of sign language to be able to understand different forms fairly easily. In our research, we found that despite Hong Kong Sign Language not being taught formally, many people ended up creating their own gestures and signs to communicate. This is one of the reasons we believe that a universal sign language would not work, as many signs and gestures adapt to the respective spoken and verbal languages as they evolve and change.